Well, hello everybody. My name's Peter North from the Greater London Authority. I work for the Mayor of London. My role is really to help others develop and deliver larger scale decentralised energy schemes to ensure that London meets its CO2 reduction targets and some of the other mayoral manifesto commitments around affordability, sustainability and secure supply. So my presentation today will really take you through the planning methodology that we've been developing over these last few years, particularly to inform planning policy, to really intervene where the private sector isn't willing to get involved in planning for larger scale decentralized energy networks that have the potential to deliver affordable heat and also the quantum of carbon savings that are necessary to meet our CO2 reduction targets. So next slide. So London, like most cities in the world, is having an increasing population. We're about 8.6 million at the moment. Our population will increase to by another million by 2030. Potentially up to 10 million by 2050. It's a trend we see in all cities globally. There's a lot more pressure on city resources. They need to think very hard about how they become increasingly energy efficient and self-sufficient. And energy infrastructure, if it's to be utilised properly, really needs to adapt more intelligently to demands and deliver environmental benefits at lower energy costs. So the energy challenge for cities, their current energy systems need to develop into more sustainable systems. We need to be far less dependent on imported fuels, so we can detach ourselves from the volatile international energy markets, and improves the security of supply both at national level and at city level. In London we predominantly use gas for building heating, natural gas, and our electricity is generated at centralised power stations at this moment in time. But cities need to think about moving towards increased use of renewables. It'll involve new types of energy carriers such as heat networks and more non-polluting energy sources. London's already in breach of its air quality limits, and therefore the concept of combustion being carried out at the city level is quite contrary to what we're trying to achieve. So district heating networks are quite significant in the ability to utilise different forms of energy that's available, particularly waste energy, and the concept of pollution reduction through more effective use of energy is becoming very important in some of our thinking around new policies and new planning. Energy efficiency is always the first port of call here, so it's about reducing demand, but we also see a very important role for energy storage, so we can decouple the availability of low carbon, zero carbon energy sources. We can decouple their availability from consumer demand, so we see energy storage as being quite important coming into the future. But it's also very important to ensure that the energy remains affordable, to ensure London remains a competitive place for people to live and work. Next slide. At this point we think about the CO2 emissions from our city. Like most Northern European cities, we consume more energy in heating our buildings than we do in contrast to transport and power generation. So the mayor really thinks in terms of what measures he can take. He's not really able to be influential in decarbonising the electricity supply. That's left at a national level, and you'll see new nuclear programmes and offshore wind being supported by national government. So instead he focuses on transport, and the subject of this presentation is about building decarbonisation. He has programs around energy efficiency, which is the first key step to reduce building energy demand, and then the area that I work in is around the decarbonisation of the energy supply to buildings, and this being predominantly heat. Sort of having said that, set out the principles, then we look to try and quantify what these mean and what this means, and establish specific targets, because this is very important to us in terms of measuring our progress. So the Mayor sets a target to supply 25% of London's energy demand from local energy sources, local energy production by the year 2025. We're then able to calculate the carbon reductions this will bring about, and importantly that over 50% of the decentralized energy opportunity will come from medium and large scale heat networks. At this moment in time, and historically, we believe combined heat and power has an important role to play, and that's because it uses the primary energy source resource very efficiently. We are being challenged by our electricity grid increasingly decarbonising with new nuclear and wind, and therefore we question the role of gas-fired CHP moving into the future. But the important concept to remember is that heat networks are what we describe as technology agnostic. It's an energy carrier. It links sources of low cost, low carbon heat to consumers, and therefore it's very adaptable for different energy sources. But we, at this moment in time, rely on natural gas in combined heat and power as one of the mainstays for development of our emerging heat networks. So having set out the targets, the aspiration, this then gets translated into London's strategic plan called the London Plan. Current one is dated back to 2011. An update is currently being drafted and will be available in 2 to 3 years' time. And we aim to build on these policy measures that we set out a number of years ago, and bring them up to date for our better understanding of environmental and energy issues within the city. But just to reflect, the role of this plan is to require new developments to meet certain CO2 targets, to actually connect to local heat networks if they're available, and introduce some level of renewable energy. And typically we see the use of photovoltaics, but the potential there is very limited in a city such as London. We also require our local boroughs to be involved in identifying and establishing district heating networks, including the development of energy master plans. And then new developers need to submit energy strategies along with their planning application, and that has to comply with the London Plan in order for the development to get their consent to enter into construction. So from the policies and from the London Plan, then in 2011 the Mayor of London produced his climate change mitigation and energy strategy, and here he articulates exactly the targets that we're expected to meet going into the future up to 2050. So once again, this strategy document is being revised. We expect a new environment strategy with an energy chapter in it to be published in a couple of months' time for consultation. It sets out far more demanding targets than we see here. For example, our new mayor, who came into power May last year, has pledged London to be a zero carbon city by 2050. The 25% energy from decentralised energy still stands as a target. We think this is worth about £8 billion investment opportunity for the private sector. So we've got to think about how we remove the barriers for these larger scale schemes to allow the private sector to come in and invest and operate in larger scale heat networks. So following that, we produced in October 2009 a prospectus for London, and this really says that the public sector will do all it can to remove barriers and enable the private sector to carry out the financing and delivery of these larger scale schemes. So in that prospectus, we set out our thinking around types of decentralized energy schemes, just so we can illustrate what we're thinking about. The type 1 schemes are specific to new buildings. They get installed in building basements and connect directly to the building heating system. So the London plan has been quite instrumental in delivering hundreds of megawatts electrical CHP plants in London. The area work that I'm involved with, that's the subject of this workshop, this presentation today, is really looking at the type 2 schemes and how we work to establish larger scale energy centres that can connect and supply heat to a range of different consumer types. This is an advantage that we have less peaks on the system, demand peaks, better diversification, which allows us to optimize the size of our energy production and provide it more effectively as an investment. So the type 2 schemes, we see the introduction of heat networks. That's the first time they emerge in our work. And ultimately, we'd like to establish, interconnect these type 2s to form these type 3s area-wide heat networks that almost delivers an energy trading type or a heat trading system supplied from larger scale power stations, energy from waste facilities, industrial facilities. So London aspires to become similar to the what we see in the Nordic countries, the Copenhagen's, Helsinki's, etc. But our bulk of our main work is around the planning for and development assistance for the type 2 schemes. So the methodology we've developed, we can now reflect back to actually set out what it looks like. So this is a summary of how we approach it, starting on the left-hand side, the capacity building. Here we carried out heat mapping, and we do this in conjunction with London's boroughs. And in heat mapping, we determine for London's case where the areas of highest heat density are. And if in those particular areas, it's fairly clear that heat networks are a fairly competitive heat supply option compared with individual heat energy boiler systems. So heat mapping, or whatever city you're from, it would be energy mapping, and it's really to establish an evidence base that helps with further policy formulation and development, and energy development approaches. One thing we found in the GLA as a strategic authority in carrying out the heat mapping is the fact that it creates more capacity within the local boroughs. So early on, people didn't understand, local officers didn't understand what decentralized energy was, the principles, why they should have it. But through this heat mapping engagement, local champions are developed who are then able to promote the projects through the local boroughs organisation, and they present it to the politicians for adoption and delivery. So from the heat mapping, the square box in the middle called energy master planning, that's where we sort of zone up areas that we think have good potential and determine the extent of a market competitive heat network. This provides very strong evidence base for development decisions, investment decisions in that specific area, which informs the local planning framework, and boroughs may only go as far as this, requiring developments to connecting heat networks or being involved with developing them. But boroughs also then have the option of moving towards the project definition and delivery phase, where with our support they carry out more feasibility study work, business case development, business plan, and then procurement. So here is an example of the London heat map. It shows the high heat density areas predominantly within the middle of the city, and if we can explore further in better granularity, we can zoom down into areas. We begin to use this heat map to put all sorts of data on it, actually, about the reports, development reports that we produce about networks, heat networks, and CHP that's installed. So it becomes a fantastic data source for everything you want to know about heat networks, which overcomes one of the information barriers that exist in cities if people want to carry out activities themselves, or they want to establish as a result of policy what they should be doing in specific areas. So in this view, we've zoomed down to a specific area in London to show you what it looks like. We're in the process of redeveloping our heat map. We want it to become more intelligent. We want to add tools to it so we can do some preliminary district heating network designs and costings and routings. And we're also involved with a European project called Thermos, which is aiming to provide a European-wide heat mapping and cooling tool. So the results of that European project won't be available for another 2 to 3 years. So now I'm just going to take you through a few examples of master plans we've carried out. As I said, the whole idea is to determine the extent of a market competitive heat network. It provides a long-term vision on how heat networks will grow and therefore inform us about how we initially dimension networks and how we need to safeguard public realm works elsewhere, so the future retrofit of an extended heat network is far more cost effective because we have this vision, this map of where the heat network needs to go. So we've completed well over 14 energy master plans so far, and we'll be carrying more out over these next couple of years. So this is an example, started about 2011 in North London. Is an area, an opportunity area as we call it, that had a lot of planned new development, tens of thousands of new homes. It also coincided with an energy from waste plant at Edmonton that was only power only. It did not use the heat it produces, so it was only about 22% energy efficient. Potentially it could deliver around about 60 megawatts of heat. There's also in the area an industrial facility operated 24/7, producing around about 7 or 8 megawatts of waste heat, and in the north of the borough there was a power station, combined cycle gas turbine power station that had potential to deliver around about 12 megawatts of heat. So we had this good combination of future potential demand and waste heat energy sources that could be utilized. And on the right hand side of the presentation there were a couple of notional heat networks shown, one following a river, a canal system, the other following a rail system, which demonstrated how heat network could form a spine, supplying, utilizing this heat from these systems to new developments. So the next series of slides shows how the study work envisaged the system growing, initially from around the energy from waste plant, connecting some local developments. So the system extends further north by 2020. So by 2030 we envisage the heat network beginning to extend further south, connecting up satellite schemes that were constructed at the time. So in a strategic context, the scheme that we see in front of us to the upper end of the presentation is what we describe as the Upper Lee Valley. It has the potential to connect to the scheme at the Olympic Park that was constructed 2012, and potentially to other developments that we're involved with in the South Park near the Royal Docks area. So these have good potential to interconnect and form these very large area wide networks, the Type 3 schemes I mentioned earlier on. So kickstarting heat networks, London doesn't have a strong background or tradition in heat networks. The UNEP regard us as an emerging champion city, so we have all the difficulties around implementing these schemes in a highly liberalised energy market. So we don't have overarching regulations, as some European cities do, about connecting to networks. So therefore we have to compete with existing infrastructure, existing energy systems. But the key points are defining your project through the Energy Master Plan, having a long-term development plan on how this gets invested in and built out. The public sector can bring along some guarantees on the major initial heat loads, noting that more commercial heat loads are potentially unreliable. They may go out of business during the duration of the development phase, and particularly the public involvement around planning policy, safeguarding routes and space for energy centres, providing this heat load guarantee, which gives us some certainty around heat revenue. Public sector in the UK is able to fund at lower discount rate than private sector, and also able to form delivery vehicles to develop these and deliver these larger scale schemes. These schemes, not only do they work in terms of CO2 reduction and return, but also potentially can deliver other public priorities and policies, such as fuel poverty. So under continued public ownership, they can at some point exit the project when it's reached its objectives. They can refinance projects because they've been entirely de-risked in terms of connecting heat customers, consumers, and construction issues are now, construction risks are now gone completely, so refinancing is a possibility, or they're able to exit to the private sector. So some of the major energy sources that we envisage, we have 4 energy from waste plants operating. Initially none of them had heat networks, and increasingly we're now working with them to install heat networks, and there's a new energy from waste plant under construction at the moment, and the local, both the GLA and the local policies around heat recovery and district heating were quite fundamental to ensuring that the Viridor scheme at Beddington was built as a CHP plant, and that it cooperates with the local borough, who's forming its own heat network company to sell heat to that network. Without the policies in place, this would never happen. The energy from waste plant would be built as power only, and we'd never have the opportunity for that heat recovery. Next slide. Further examples involve cases where we have surplus heat. So this was a hospital that installed a new gas turbine. It had 2 megawatts of heat that was lost to the flue. We included a small heat exchanger to recover the low temperature heat and connect it to an existing communal heating system. supplying social housing in Camden. Another example here is a new build. So this is a small gas-fired CHP scheme, and the tower there is a heat accumulator. This was constructed by the London Borough of Islington. It has one gas engine, about 1.9 megawatts electrical. It's installed 1.5 miles of heat network supplying over 850 homes. And it's currently being expanded to other areas with plans to incorporate waste heat from the London Metro system. But it gives you an example of the range of technologies and approaches that we have for energy production. So our latest thinking is really around, rather than burning gas, maybe using London's waste heat. So 2013, we completed a study into London's secondary heat resource. That's heat from rivers, ground, industrial undertakings, sewage treatment plants, etc. And we concluded that London has the potential, in combination with heat pumps, to actually heat itself from its own environmental and waste heat. So these are some of the potential sources we looked at. The dark green bar is the primary energy, the energy source, and the light green bar is the amount of electricity we would need to install, utilize into making that heat source, raise it to a usable temperature in a heat network. So power station heat, building city building cooling systems look all sort of fairly attractive, along with water treatment plants. Interestingly, individual air source heat pumps consume perhaps the largest amount of electricity, and therefore, because of the impact it would have on the upstream electricity system in terms of cable sizing and power stations necessary to run this during the sort of winter periods, this would be probably our least favoured source, and we would concentrate on the sources really that provide the least electricity demand. Okay, so looking forward, we are producing what we call the London Energy Plan tool, which should be released later this year. It will allow us to develop scenarios of how we would meet our 2050 zero carbon target. So it allows us to play around a little bit with the different types of systems, particularly thinking about the electrification of heat, and what the system impacts and costs will be. One of our sort of fundamental areas of thinking that should be reflected in the new energy strategy that's being produced at the moment is the effective use of energy, actually using the appropriate quality of energy for low quality applications such as building heating. So this is a principle of sustainability, and we think we would like to articulate this far better in our forthcoming energy strategy and approaches. So that's really quite an exciting development for us. It's a hard concept to get over. We primarily focused on CO2 reduction and energy efficiency, but energy effectiveness is, we think, a field previously explored by sort of academia, that we think would be very important to allow us to properly assess the different infrastructure alternatives to meet the 2050 zero carbon target. Next slide.